In The City of God, Augustine presents a sharp critique of Roman religion and its influence on moral life. In Book 2, chapters 6 to 14, he deconstructs the connection between pagan gods, theatre, and the moral decline of Roman society. Let's explore how Augustine reveals the emptiness of pagan worship and its impact on Roman values. Chapter 6. The pagan gods' lack of moral teaching. Augustine begins by arguing that the pagan gods never provided any moral instruction to their worshippers. Unlike Christian churches, which he says teach virtue, pagan temples had no purpose in guiding people toward righteous living. He even challenges anyone to point to a place where the gods taught holiness of life. To strengthen his point, Augustine quotes the Roman poet Persius, who critiques the superficial pursuit of wealth and indulgence. Learn what God meant thee to be, and what place he has ordered you to fill. For Augustine, this kind of introspection and moral guidance was completely absent in pagan worship. Philosophers versus pagan gods. In chapter 7, Augustine compares philosophers like Plato and Socrates to the pagan gods. While philosophers taught valuable lessons about ethics and virtue, their teachings were flawed and lacked divine authority. He questions why these thinkers, who sought to guide people toward goodness, weren't honored like the gods. Instead, Roman society glorified gods like Jupiter, who in plays like Terence's Eunuchus were depicted as morally corrupt. Augustine is appalled by this. Why worship gods whose behavior was worse than that of humans? He implies that Roman society was captivated by immoral behavior rather than seeking true moral improvement. Theatre and pagan worship. Chapter 8 introduces Augustine's harsh critique of Roman theatre. The plays performed at religious festivals were often based on the scandalous behaviors of the gods themselves. These theatrical performances weren't just entertainment, they were seen as part of a liberal education for Roman youth. Augustine questions how people could be expected to live virtuously when the gods they worshipped were being portrayed as morally corrupt on stage. He draws a parallel to modern-day media, noting that just as Hollywood influences our values, Roman theatre encouraged people to imitate the immoral behaviors of the gods. Roman hypocrisy in protecting honor. In chapter 9, Augustine cites Cicero's De Republica to highlight a striking contradiction in Roman culture. While Romans forbade poets from slandering citizens, they allowed their gods to be ridiculed and depicted in shameful ways. Augustine questions why human dignity was protected while the gods were freely insulted. This, he argues, reveals a deep inconsistency in Roman values. They cared more about their city's honor than the gods they claimed to revere. True or false, the gods are immoral. Chapter 10 takes this critique further, suggesting that whether the stories about the gods were true or false, they still depicted immoral actions. These gods were willing to be shown as morally corrupt because their primary goal was to mislead humanity. For Augustine, this reveals the deceitful nature of these deities, which he sees not as gods, but as devils actively leading people astray. Honoring actors as priests. In chapter 11, Augustine points to the Greeks who honored actors like priests because their performances were thought to please the gods. This blending of performance and worship deeply troubled Augustine, who believed that honoring actors for immoral portrayals of the gods only deepened the moral confusion of the time. Moral inconsistencies in Roman law. In chapter 12, Augustine praises the Romans for making it a capital crime for poets to slander citizens, but criticizes them for allowing their gods to be portrayed in shameful ways. How could a society protect the honor of mortals but not of the divine? This, Augustine argues, shows the Romans valued their city more than their pantheon. Plato versus Roman gods, the final contrast. In chapters 13 and 14, Augustine contrasts the philosopher Plato, who banished poets from his ideal city to protect the moral fabric of society, with the Roman gods who reveled in immoral behavior on stage. Plato, Augustine argues, upheld moral values that even the gods failed to meet. The inconsistency between pagan worship and true moral guidance became even more glaring in light of these comparisons. Conclusion. In these chapters, Augustine makes a compelling case that Roman society, in its reverence for morally corrupt gods and indulgent theatrical performances, was on a path of moral collapse. His critique remains relevant today. If we allow our values to be shaped by immoral figures, whether gods or modern media icons, we risk losing our moral compass. Augustine's challenge is clear: to seek out true virtue and reject the influences that lead us away from righteous living.